during the pandemic, even though the research around this had started long before then, that's sort of where I think most teachers' awareness started to come around trauma-informed teaching. And then I had a chance to try it out myself as I was going through a yoga teacher training program. So I am a certified Kundalini yoga and meditation teacher, and it was during that training that I had where I really got to start to put into practice some of the trauma-informed teaching. From there, I dug into some of the research and professional literature around it, applied to actual classroom teaching. And it seemed to me like there was a lot out there on the practices around trauma-informed teaching, but there wasn't a whole lot that was specific to how to apply it to the world language classroom. And so I started to cobble together different ideas, and I wanted to bring this to teachers because I thought that it would be really useful for us to see this in action in an applied way. And so for our time together today, we're going to explore how to integrate trauma-informed teaching practices in the world language classroom. And specifically, we're going to align it with the practices with New York State World Language Standards. So if you could switch the next slide, please. Just to anchor our work today, we want to look at, basically what I'm going to do today is go over a very basic definition of trauma, what it means to be a trauma-informed teacher, what those practices look like from a broad sort of bird's eye view. And then we'll dig into some specific teaching practices for each of the standards. We'll start with interpretive, we'll move into the interpersonal, we'll expand out into the presentational, and then I'm going to combine standards 4 and 5 to talk about some ideas for culture. That way you can see some specific examples, and then we'll break out into individual work rooms so you can start to try on some of these ideas for yourselves. Next slide, please. So our session objectives, you can go ahead and click through the 3 objectives. Our first, we want to understand the principles of trauma-informed teaching and how they support language learning. So it's not as though, trauma-informed teaching exists in this vacuum, but they actually support the specific objectives that we have for our kids in terms of their ability to access and acquire language skills. And then we'll examine strategies on how to align the sort of theory in a really practical way and how to align that with the New York State World Language Standards. And then finally, we'll have some time to develop some tools to improve student engagement and resilience while meeting language proficiency goals. And I just love this little poster here with a quote by Dan Levy from Schitt's Creek that says that support, encouragement, and love, 3 relatively simple acts of kindness that can change the course of a person's life. And so, we can, as teachers, we tend to get kind of very academic and kind of, into the theory. But ultimately, this is what grounds me every day in my work and, applying this lens to the kids that we teach. Next slide, please. So as an opening activity, I'd like to invite everyone to reflect for a moment on how a trauma-informed environment can influence learning. So any ideas that you have that come up when you think about a trauma-informed environment or just trauma in general, you can go ahead and jot your ideas down in the chat. I'll take a look and see what comes up for you. Yep, so we've got child will not be able to be focused, right? Students may appear withdrawn and not engaged, right? The students might not be doing assignments outside of the class, right? So homework. I'll give this about 30 more seconds. Certain assignments or words may be triggers for them. Yeah, exactly. Or certain units, certain topics, for sure. When a student is stressed, he or she cannot easily retain the knowledge, right? Exactly. So, yeah, trauma-informed practices overlap with culturally responsive teaching in the brain. They overlap with our work around equity. When a student is stressed, he or she cannot easily retain knowledge. Yep, good. All right. Learning their outside situation and best support them accordingly. Exactly. Yeah. So students may be sensitive to some topics. All right, great. So I'm going to go ahead and close the chat. You can still continue to add ideas if they're popping into your head, but we're going to go ahead and move on and maybe return to them later. Okay, so you can go ahead and, so what is trauma? So I wanted to just kind of give us, I think a lot of us have ideas about what trauma is. And if you start to dig into this research on your own, you know, there are a lot of different ways to kind of conceptualize trauma and what it is and where its boundaries are. And you know, there are kind of two different directions that I want to go in. One is that, you know, trauma has become a bit of a buzzword in our culture. So you may have heard or even said to yourself something along the lines of, oh, I was traumatized by that test or that class or that video or that film. And understandably, it's been applied in many contexts, often to mean that an experience was negative or stressful. And because of this, the word trauma and traumatic have become overextended in application in a way that can dilute their meaning. So, on the one hand, we don't want to sort of overextend it to anything that is just sort of stressful or negative. And the fact is that there's an important difference between a difficult or painful experience and traumatic ones. Could you go ahead and go to the next slide, please? So I have a quote here by Dr. Peter Levine, who outlines this very nicely for us. All traumatic events are stressful, but not all stressful events are traumatic. So it's one of those, you know, a square, is there a rectangle is a square, but a square isn't always a rectangle type thing. And the key distinction here is that an event is traumatic if it leaves a person more limited than before in a way that persists over time. So a lot of life can be upsetting, distressing, and even very painful without being traumatic. Next slide, please. And then the other quote here comes from the work of Dr. Gabor Mate. I don't know if folks are familiar with him, but he's lovely. He's on social media. He has a number of books. He really breaks down a lot of trauma-informed theory or theory around childhood trauma for lay people. And so his quote here is that trauma is not what happens to you, it's what happens inside of you as a result of what's happened to you. This has some really important implications for our work with students. The first is that you can have two kids who have experienced the exact same event, and one student might have experienced trauma as a result of that because of what's happening to their nervous system and to their brain, and another student might be totally fine. And so we're going to keep that in mind as we continue to go on here. So there are two kinds of trauma, and this is going to, so on the one hand, you know, sometimes folks tend to overextend the meaning. On the other hand, you know, there's sometimes people can think of it as being only like some sort of big thing. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So that's what people often think of as the big T trauma. So you can go ahead and just kind of click through these different things. Those are those catastrophic events. Those are those natural disasters. You know, if you have a refugee family coming in, they're fleeing war, persecution, political violence, all those kinds of things, political suppression. Maybe a family's gone through a really difficult, messy divorce. Maybe a student has lost a parent. Basically anything that's on those adverse childhood experiences list. If you're not familiar with that, that's another direction you can go in to extend your learning here, to look at ACE scores. Domestic violence, abuse, those are kind of the things that I think sometimes people think of as being traumatic. And if it's anything shy of that, then it's not necessarily trauma. So go ahead to the next slide, please. And again, you can click through the different bubbles once you get there. And then on the other hand, we have these little t traumas, and that's the impact. That's the impact of exposure to either a distressing relationship over time or where something should have happened that didn't happen. So those might be things like peer bullying or repeated harsh comments by a parent, those are things that as teachers we may not see. We may not get, a trauma, sort of diagnosis around a child, but it might be something that's very much a part of their reality and is influencing their ability to show up for us every day. And then on the other hand, there might be something missing that really should be happening for them. So things like being seen and not being accepted, or there being a lack of emotional connection with a grown-up. You can go ahead and switch the slides. All right, so we're going to ground our work in 5 fundamental truths here. Go ahead and click. The first is that trauma exists. The second is that trauma is widespread. So trauma is much more widespread than we first realized, and we're going to dig into some of the research around that. Trauma is harmful to the brain, and it can impact development and learning. We need to support students who have experienced trauma. This is just part of being teachers who are committed to equity. And then children are resilient. And so this is kind of where our work comes in. Within positive environments, they can grow, learn, and succeed. And actually, this past fall, I did a session on cultivating healing space. And so it was orienting, our practices to actually setting things up in our world language classroom to help kids to be able to strengthen their relationships, to build responsibility and develop resilience. And so that's a different area, a different direction we could go with this topic. All right, you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So starting off with trauma exists, you can go ahead and click again. Trauma is a reality for many children and not just a possibility, but it's a frequent part of children's lives. And so this comes to us from Mental Health America. Go ahead. Trauma is widespread, so you can go ahead and click. So this data comes to us from the CDC, and this was just published this past October, and it was based on, a survey that was given in 2023. And this sort of shocked me at first when I read it, and it said that 3 out of 4 high school students experienced at least one potentially traumatic event, including violence, abuse, or exposure to mental health or substance use problems. Now, we want to take that with a little bit of a grain of salt. It's not to say that 3 out of 4 of our high school students have been traumatized, but if they've experienced that event, again, it's about what happens inside of them. They potentially are. And then the other piece of data that I thought was interesting that came out of this is that 1 in 5 high school students reported experiencing at least 4 events. And so referring back to those adverse childhood experiences, those ACE scores, what we know about that is that 1 event plus 1 event does not equal 2. With each traumatic or potentially traumatic event that a person experiences, the impact is exponential. So it's not as though 1 plus 1 equals 2. It's more of a multiple, right, of that happening, and that compounds and sort of creates these layers that over time can impede our kids from accessing curriculum. Okay, you can go ahead and click the button one more time here. And then the other part, so the first quote here talks about sort of the breadth of the expansiveness of this. And then this also talks about sort of the socioeconomic implications of this. So trauma can happen in all communities, all cultures, and all settings. It doesn't care what race we are, what religion we practice, where we live, what our family makeup is, what our sexual orientation or identity is, or what our role is in society. And I want to say that again with the caveat that the research also says that people who belong to historically marginalized groups tend to experience, more of these kinds of events. However, I think sometimes a misconception that people have around this is that, if you're from a well-resourced community or a rich family, that you're somehow insulated from these events, and that's not the case at all. This can impact folks. And so I, teach in a well-resourced community just outside of Boston. And, just this year, I found out that one of my students' mothers was institutionalized for an addiction. And so, and I wouldn't necessarily have known that if his liaison hadn't reached out and let me know that. So this kind of underscores why the next point that I'm going to get into, why we need to set up these supports for all of our kids. Go ahead. So trauma is harmful to the brain and can affect development and learning. So some of you touched on that before. You can go ahead and click. Trauma can affect basic learning. So students who've experienced trauma may have problems thinking clearly or reasoning. Their brains may be so used to surviving that they aren't able to maintain focus. I know someone mentioned that in the chat on learning or taking in new information. Their distraction may impact how they can follow directions or remember what to do from task to task. And I've sort of bolded the key words here because if we just sort of take a scan at this piece of research, a lot of this is really foundational for kids being able to do school. And so again, this is why having a trauma-informed lens, having some trauma-informed practices in our toolkit are really going to help to make sure that we reach all of our students. Go ahead. We need to support students who have experienced trauma. So students who have experienced trauma and display these symptoms in the classroom may be diagnosed with a disability instead of getting the support that they need. So the research around trauma in particular actually goes back to the 1970s with veterans coming home from the Vietnam War. And they were experiencing psychiatric symptoms like hallucinations and night terrors. And what was happening to them is there wasn't enough understanding around what they were going through. And so, doctors would give them a diagnosis and then they would give them a treatment based on that diagnosis, but the treatment wasn't helping them because it wasn't really getting at the root of their problem. It wasn't really getting at, they were basically being misdiagnosed. And so likewise, this can happen to kids in our classrooms. They may be diagnosed with a disability and given supports that don't necessarily help their specific needs. Along the same lines, they can overlap, right? You can have students who have, learning disabilities, behavioral issues that overlap with having trauma histories. You can go ahead and click. And then, this other piece I think is important to keep in mind that nearly every child in the country is suffering to some degree from the psychological effects of the pandemic. It feels like, it was years ago now at this point, but it's still very much with us. It still affects me as a teacher, especially when I'm, going into crowded spaces. That's why schools need to invest now in the mental health and well-being of our kids in a broad and comprehensive way, not just for children with learning disabilities and diagnosed mental health conditions, but for all of our kids, right? So lots of kids are still kind of coming off of the pandemic and, the tumultuous, without getting too political, but just some of the changes that we're seeing, with the switch of administration, right? Moving from one to the next and just sort of, the things that can come up for families and people as we're going through that change. All right, so next slide, please. And then again, this is the part that I like to focus on. So children are resilient, and within positive environments, they can grow, learn, and succeed. And so the classroom and school environments have enormous therapeutic capacity for vulnerable young people. The classroom can be positioned as a powerful place of intervention for post-traumatic healing. And so, I don't want that to actually don't want that to scare anybody, because I think sometimes a misconception around this is that we as teachers need to have some sort of specialized, psychological training to be able to meet kids' needs. And, as our main goals here are to make sure that we're not re-traumatizing kids when they come into our class. And you really don't need to have that specialized training. Like, it certainly can help, but just, kind of putting into place the ecosystem in our classroom for building those relationships, for giving kids choice, and for, getting into some of the things that we're going to talk about later on are really enough to help kids to build trust in themselves and in you and in school and in their peers, to really start to bring back that sense of being able to do things, that sense of resilience. Okay, we can go ahead and move on. All right, and so what are trauma-informed practices? We're going to dive into just, again, how we can apply that idea of trauma and how we can kind of meet it with some of our practices in the classroom. Go ahead. So I think at its core, trauma-informed practices represent a perspective shift in how we understand and respond to student behaviors. So again, going back to that, the original research around this, rather than addressing the behaviors in themselves, we want to think about what's behind the behaviors, and being able to address that. And we don't necessarily need to know the specifics about a kid's trauma history in order to be able to do that, right, with the tools that we have in our kit as teachers. But the idea here is, we don't want to punish kids so much for their behaviors, but we want to put into place the supports that they need to be able to get them from, the starting line to the target where we want them to end up. Okay, go ahead. So our two goals of trauma-informed practices, you can go ahead and just click through these two, are number one, we want to help kids to heal their dysregulated stress response and build self-regulatory skills. This is really where our work as world language teachers, it's a two-way relationship. We need them to sort of heal the stress response and to build those skills in order to be able to learn the language. And by learning the language, right, they're developing those skills, that sense of self-esteem, that sense of resilience, that they're able to succeed out in the real world. And then supporting students to form enduring and healing attachments, right? So often, we're some of the steadiest relationships that kids have right throughout their lives and throughout their day, just being by nature, being school teachers and being the place that they come to. All right, and so 3 considerations. The first is that trauma-informed teaching is really about creating an ecosystem. So there are lists out there, like if you wanted to dive into this topic a little bit more to extend beyond what we're doing here in the session, there are definitely lists of trauma-informed practices that you can go through. But I think it's more helpful to us if we think about it as creating an ecosystem. And each student is different, and things aren't always linear and simple. And if the right conditions are not there, trauma-informed practices actually won't take hold. So it's really about starting off, in day one, and you can kind of pick up, even though we're mid-year, you can pick up where we are and kind of reset things, if you can forecast the changes for kids and kind of set them up, in a scaffolded way. But just starting off by building those relationships and doing the work to get to know our kids and sort of learning what is going to fit for them and what is going to help them. I can think of a specific example that came up in the Cult of Pedagogy podcast, where Alex Chevron Bennett was interviewed, and she is a school leader and an expert on trauma-informed practices in education. And she shared a story about a teacher who had a student who was, was consistently, dysregulated and needed some support. And she sort of quietly, talked to the kid on the side, had a few conversations with him to figure out a system that would work. They determined that if she gave him a signal, like maybe it was tugging on the ear, that kid would see that and he would know that he could go and take a break, and he knew the expectations around it, and was able to kind of self-regulate that way. She then went into the workroom, and there was a colleague who was having similar issues with the kid. She shared that practice with that teacher. He went in and, without having done the groundwork, tugged on the ear, and it completely backfired. The kid just did not respond well. And not only did it compromise the relationship with the second teacher who did it, but it also revealed to the kid that his confidence had been betrayed, right? Or at least that's how he felt with that first teacher. So it kind of made them start over from scratch to find that trust building again. So it's important that all these pieces be in place. And so you can go ahead and advance the slides. And so, I think it's important to bring this home to why we need trauma-informed skills as world language teachers. So the first part is that, this is a big part of our commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. It lays the groundwork for authentic, low anxiety engagement for kids. It creates conditions for meaningful communication and exploration. And language and identity are deeply intertwined. Part of our ability to connect with a target culture is directly proportional to our skills in a language, and the development of our skills in a language relies on feeling emotionally connected to the community around us. And so that's really why, this is, I think, essential to our work as language teachers. Go ahead. All right, so let's dig into some specific examples. How can teachers integrate trauma-informed practices into world language teaching? So I'm going to start and go through the different standards. So the first is the interpretive communication. So our trauma-informed goal here is to create a safe and supported understanding and interpretation of diverse texts. And so, three ideas that I'm going to show you. And again, we only have an hour, so there are a lot of different directions we can go in with trauma informed, but I just kind of want to give you a sense of how to incorporate this lens. The first is scaffolding interpretive tasks. This helps to reduce the cognitive load, which can then help to reduce the emotional overwhelm that kids might be feeling. The second is to use chunking to break text or audio into manageable parts and provide guiding questions to help them focus their attention. And this will make more sense when I show you the example. And then finally, starting off by incorporating low stakes formative assessment tasks, things that involve nonverbal responses like circling, matching, highlighting. Okay, you can go ahead and advance the slide. So this is an example of a scaffolded interpretive task. Our learning target here was to be able to identify biographical information about a person. And so they watched a video of a man sort of describing what his life was like when he was a teenager. And so you'll see on the left side here, we had some pre-reading vocab. And so these were specific words that weren't necessarily in the unit vocabulary, but were essential for kids to be able to understand what was happening in the video. So we had a couple of little sort of meaning-based tasks for them. And then, so I just got a question that said, will we receive a copy of the presentation? You absolutely will. I have a QR code. I've got it at different places throughout, and I'll pause to give you guys a chance to take a picture of that. And so, yeah, you can use this in meaning, and then we recycle that, right, for the post reading when the students are trying to then answer some analytical questions about the text. They have that vocabulary again to help guide their answers. You can go ahead and, all right. So this is one that I think this has been really effective for kids not getting overwhelmed with lengthy articles. And that's chunking the article into manageable parts and providing guiding questions. So rather than having all of the interpretive questions at the end of a video or in this case, at the end of an article, you're giving them those questions after the part of the article that they're most relevant. So our learning target here was I could describe and debate the pros and cons of a new technology for my phone. This was an article that was, I'm a Spanish teacher, so my examples are Spanish. But you can apply this to really any language where this was an article that spanned 3 pages. So rather than kids seeing that big block of text and getting overwhelmed, this kind of highlights specific things that I wanted them to look at. The other thing I have kids doing here is to circle where they found the answer so that they're not just kind of guessing, but they actually have to go and find the root of their evidence. Go ahead. All right, and then this is one that back when I was a middle school teacher, I set up, and I thought that this was a good one for low stakes formative assessments, and I would use this actually in any intro class at any and in any level in secondary school. So our learning target here was I can identify classes people take based on what I see or hear. So again, they're given a school schedule and they are circling the cognates, and if they're able to do that, then they might take it a step further and fill in that chart on the other side to make those language connections. So that's something that's really simple, something that's going to kind of give them a stepping stone before they do some of the more analytical type questions. And so, with these scaffolds, I think the caveat is that, eventually we want to help them to progress to higher order questions. So inferencing, analysis, once the kids have built the confidence to go there. So the question here was, let's see, the questions were in English, but the text was in Spanish. And what language are they answering the questions? Great question. So one of the reasons why in our department, so we work with thematic units, and the texts are in Spanish, but then the language that they're answering the questions in is in English, and that's to prevent them from just copying the Spanish word. We want them to actually interpret and show that. For this type of task. Okay, we can go ahead and move on to the next set. All right, so for interpersonal, the interpersonal, that's that speaking one, and that for kids can be really triggering, right? So our goal here is to build trust and safety and spontaneous interaction. So I've got two trauma-informed practices that I want to focus on. The first is using structured pair or group work to encourage collaboration without the fear of judgment. And then the second one is to incorporate choice in topics to enhance student autonomy and reduce anxiety. So let's take a look at a couple of examples of how we're doing that. You can go ahead and advance. So this is an activity I did with kids last week, and the learning target was I can debate which technologies are most important in my life and explain why. So the first thing we did was I put up a Padlet on my projector screen where kids could use a QR code to go in, and then we just did a big brainstorm in Spanish of all the different technologies that are really important in their lives. Then as a class, we had a conversation where we got to sort of call or pick out the top 8 and put them on the left side of that bracket. And then what I did, because what ends up happening is when I have an entire class discussion, there may be like 5 kids who are doing all the talking. So to help sort of pull kids out of their shell a little bit, I would then take that big conversation for the class and then break kids up into small groups if they're able to do that, or maybe even just partners, right? If they're still shy, or even maybe they would just have a conversation, one-on-one and with me, depending on how severe a student's anxiety is around this. And then they would be able to kind of go through, and it's basically a bracket challenge. They would have to debate the pros and cons of each technology and, eventually get to the one that their group thinks is the best. Okay, next slide. And then this one actually, so with the family unit, I actually really like the way that this is set up. So the question is, what does family mean to me? That really opens up things to incorporate a lot of choice, a lot of agency, a lot of chances for students to be affirmed in whatever family means to us. Now, family can be a loaded topic for kids, because we don't necessarily know what's going on with their families at home. And we still think that there are going to be situations in life when kids are using Spanish or whatever target language, and they need to be able to communicate about family or understand about family. So this is an important topic for kids, and developmentally, meets kids where they are. So there are some important, I think, there's important considerations that we put into place before we start the unit. So in this unit, I give kids this sort of introduction by saying that we'll be talking about families. And for some people, this topic can be challenging. And I give them some options. So at any point in the unit, you can choose not to answer a question. And I give them the target language to be able to say that, make up information about your family, right? Talk about a famous family instead. Ask to be excused and take a walk, right? If it's too much for them. Now, I want to be careful with that one because, there might be kids who, are a little bit smart alecky and will, say, oh, well, I'm just going to leave class, but it would be something that we would have, a conversation about, so that I could coach them through whether that's a good solution for them or not. And then describe who you truly believe is in your family. It could be friends, neighbors, your sports team, etc. And again, I always want to affirm to kids that they'll never be asked to share any information that they're not comfortable sharing. And this has come up, this has definitely come up with kids. I have a project that I do with my intro class where students they make like a slideshow with different members of their family. And again, it's what I like about this is it gets us away from that family tree where, some of the differences in families might be highlighted. And it might make kids feel marginalized. And so it gives kids a lot of opportunity to be able to talk about a family in the way that they conceive it. But I had a student who came to me and said, I wanted them to, I invited them to ask pictures. And, one student said to me, I don't really want, my parents don't really want any pictures of them, shared out. And I said, that's fine. You can just search up an image of an activity that family member likes to do, right? And so you can incorporate that instead. So if your grandmother likes knitting, you could put, a picture of knitting needles and some yarn or something. So you don't necessarily, so it's just, again, you're going to want to meet kids where they are, with whatever needs that they express to you, and you can kind of get creative around that. But the idea behind this is just to give us a starting point. Okay, you can go ahead and advance the slides. So for presentational communication, our goal here is to empower learners to share ideas in diverse, low-pressure formats. So I'm going to talk through three different strategies. The first is to offer the option to record speaking submissions instead of making kids do live presentations. This gives us, what this does for us as teachers is it expands our toolbox of different supports that we can give to kids to help reduce their performance anxiety while meeting assessment requirements. They'll use incremental growth through a gradual process by building in structured planning phases. So we might start with brainstorming, drafting, peer reviews, and use graphic organizers, right, to help reduce the pressure. And then using checklists to provide clear expectations that help kids to reduce anxiety about performance. So let's take a look at the specific practices. You can go ahead and click. All right, so the first, without going over the big block of text that is the assessment we had, I just want to highlight that our learning target here was to discuss what my life was like as a preteen. And then we asked kids to create a short 2-minute video where they talk about it. I want to scroll down to the trauma-informed option. So the first would be to offer kids an alternative format. So allow students to keep their camera off, record audio over slideshow or a video of images instead of appearing on camera. We might offer students an alternative setting, so allowing students to create their recording to you one-on-one or maybe in a private space. We can also have kids chunk their submissions, so allowing students to record and submit sections of their presentation rather than doing it all in one take, right? And we can encourage kids to do multiple takes, right? So if they're totally unhappy with the first one, they know that they have that. And actually by kind of allowing kids to do multiple takes, just knowing that they have that can reduce their anxiety enough so that they end up not needing it. And then finally, providing flexible timelines to reduce the pressure of completing the task under tight deadlines. So being flexible where we can. I mean, what I try to do is sort of take that coaching stance where I'm on the kid's side. I can't, unless there are extenuating circumstances, in our school, I can't push, I can't extend beyond like our term limits, like the limit of a quarter or something like that. But, if a kid just isn't able to do something at a particular time, just giving them some flexible options for that, in whatever way makes sense in your environment, in your class, I think it can be another way to just help kids to feel like we're there to support them. All right, next slide. So this is a whatever I need block, and you can set this up for any way that works for your class, but this is the idea. You can do this maybe in the last week or the last class even before you have a speaking assessment, presentational, where I give kids options for how they want to spend time on what they actually need. So station one would be like writing an outline of what they'll talk about, and they can bring that to me for feedback. Station two might be working on a graphic organizer to get started on ideas. Station three would be like maybe kind of cultivating different language chunks that they want to be able to use, if it's vocabulary, if it's their sentence starters or their transitions, or maybe they want to work on verbs, that's something that they could do. Station four would be actually practicing with a partner for feedback. And then station five could be like, if they're doing a slideshow or something like that for their presentation, they could work on slides. So again, this would have to be tweaked for whatever works for your class or for whatever the assessment is. But the idea is that kids would have choice in, what they're working on, and giving them, it's kind of like a ladder. They would start off, at one stage, and if they don't feel like they need that, they could start off at a higher rung to get them ultimately to the task and learning target. Okay, go ahead. And then this last one is the checklist. So this is a task that we call like yo puedo hacer número. So it means like I can do number. And our learning target here is, this was for an introduction class. So I can have short conversation with a partner to learn information, to share information about ourselves. You could definitely level this up. You can make this as simple as possible, or you can make it even more complex. But basically, like this would be preparing kids for a speaking test, a presentational, or actually this would be interpersonal in this case, but you could definitely modify this to make it presentational as well. But they would basically go through this checklist with a partner or another classmate, and that partner, if the student is able to do it, the partner would check it off, right? They would sign their initials, and then they would go through each one of these, going back kind of back and forth, making sure that they're able to do it. This highlights for kids like what they actually know and what they need to continue studying. So this is a good check check for understanding or check for comprehension. And so they would go through two students, and then, if it's a middle school class, I might have them come and check with me as the teacher. I might offer that as an option for kids in high school, or they might do a third person. So it's kind of up to you and how, what works for your class and your kids and in the structure at your school. Okay, go ahead. And then this is the last set of examples I'm going to give us, and then I want us to have some time to dig in to apply this to your own teaching. And so I've combined the relating cultural practices and products to perspectives and cultural comparisons here. So our trauma-informed goal would be to build cultural understanding while respecting student emotional readiness. And so two different examples I have here are encouraging exploration of cultural practices through a strength-based lens, avoiding stereotypes, and then also creating opportunities for self-reflection to connect students' identities with the target culture. So you can go ahead. We'll take a look at two different ideas here. So our learning target for this task was for kids to be able to compare and contrast my classroom to classrooms in some Colombian schools. And so again, in order to avoid, or in order to move away from, a single story, a stereotype, I try to, whenever we're showing, whether there's families or schools or, the environmental homes in different countries, making sure that we're showing, we're obviously not able to show every single, existence that's there in another country, but we can show that, not everyone does things the same way. There might be, more urban schools, more rural schools, right? That same diversity and plurality exists. And so the way we would do that is choosing texts, videos, and activities that includes a range of voices and perspectives from countries where the target language is spoken. Okay, so go ahead to the next one. And then for this one, connecting students' identities with the target culture. So the learning target here was I can discuss teenage popular trends in my culture and compare them to those in the target culture without going over the specifics. One of the things that I did for what I like about the way that this assessment is set up is that kids are obviously comparing and contrasting their culture, and in this case it was other teenagers from Argentina, but they also have an opportunity to provide a different perspective of a surrounding community or a different geographic location. So that way, I have students who are from immigrant families, or they have, lived in other countries or spent a significant time abroad, and they actually really love this. So it helps them to feel, more connected to the content. They're able to share what it is that they know, whether it's about K-pop, for kids who are from East Asia, or there's a certain kind of, I think, football that's played in Australia. I have a student from Australia who, focused on that. And so it's just different kinds of cultural products and practices that they're able to bring in and connect to their own lives. Okay, go ahead. So I have here the QR code for slides for folks who have asked that. And before we get into breakout rooms, we're going to spend, maybe 5 or so minutes in breakout rooms with folks, so you can start to kind of process some of what we've gone over. And before we do that, I just want to check in and see if there are any questions that people have. You can go ahead and write them in the chat. Do you provide sentence starters and vocab lists when designing these last activities? Oh, definitely. Yeah. So absolutely. You can definitely provide sentence starters and vocab lists. And, those are scaffolds. So again, it's one of those things where we want to keep them in place as long as kids know them. Can you also put a link to the slides in the chat? Okay, I'm going to have to ask. Actually, yeah, I can do that.
So I just did.
Okay.
And then, but there was also a question earlier that I was waiting till the end. And Karina asked, to what extent should guidance counselors inform teachers about, or maybe not guidance counselors, but anyone like a social worker or anyone inform teachers about a student situation?
That's
But
a really good question, and I think it's on a case by case basis. And I mean, just we don't. One of the things that comes up over and over again in the research around trauma informed is that as teachers, we don't actually need to know the specifics. As long as we're putting these supports in place for kids, they're gonna like all kids are gonna feel affirmed, and they're gonna feel like they're supported and like they're able to they're not being overwhelmed, or like the rug is being pulled out from underneath them, like they're being betrayed. All right, great. So actually, can we give folks about 5 minutes in the breakout rooms? Maybe 4? campus on time.
How many do you want in the breakout rooms?
Per breakout room,
Yes.
we have what, 34 participants, so maybe groups of 4,
Okay.
5.
And how long do you want?
I'll let them go for, well, I would give it just kind of looking at the time. We can give them 5 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you.
I can open those now.
Great.
Amanda, do you think we should stop recording now, or do you think there'll be something to close with at the end?
So at the end, I was going to give people a chance to kind of share out in the chat and then give them my contact information if they want to stay in touch. And then I know you wanted to kind of there. I know that Jill had written that we wanted to leave a minute at the end too for you folks to finish with them as well. So um, that's up to you. I'm not sure what's going to be most useful to your group.
Well, let's pause the recording now for
Okay.
breakouts, and then we'll be started. Amanda, you're
Yeah. Are we
there.
back at it now?
Yep.
Okay. So is everyone back?
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much. So I guess as just kind of thank you everybody for participating. I'm sure like once you started talking about it, it was probably hard to come back. And so this is definitely a topic I would encourage everybody to continue thinking about and talking about with your colleagues. And like I said, it's super crucial and critical in the world we're living in now as ever. And so if anybody wants to just kind of quickly share out any thoughts that you came up with in your group um, for everyone, if anything came up that was really poignant, we'll give folks a chance to, or any last questions you've got. And this is definitely not the last chance that you have to share any ideas that you have. It seems like for every group of colleagues that I bring this to, you know, someone shares something, another aspect of this, another dimension that this work takes on, you know, in life, and so in you know in real teaching. And so, yeah, creating a pre-survey of topics that may be sensitive to students, wonderful. Not only is getting that information helpful for us as teachers, but also the act of asking your kids about what matters to them, right, is a trauma-informed practice. Um, and it might be, you know, if your school or your, you know, your class has a set curriculum, it might be difficult to make those adjustments, but you know, you can kind of make those game time decisions. This actually came up this week because in our Spanish 4 course, our teachers were planning to teach a whole unit on immigration. And just given, you know, this weekend and last week and what happened, you know, at the federal level, they decided that even if they can sort of make it a little bit easier for one student, it's worth it. So they're going to kind of rehaul 3 months worth of curriculum to try to make it a little bit more easeful for our kids during this time. So yeah, giving students a voice in the classroom, as Annette pointed out, and using popular videos to motivate interest. Yeah, TikTok videos, Reels, those kinds of things can help folks to stay connected. Well, we've only got about a minute left, and so I just want to kind of finish by inviting everyone to stay in contact with me. The QR code for the PDF of these slides is here again for anyone who would like it. My email address, you can follow me on the socials. Like I said, this is not the last chance you'll have to talk about this. So definitely stay in touch, and that's where I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Why don't we give a little virtual clap praise? I feel like it's always a hard thing to do virtually, but uh, the in terms of the attendance, please note that we have recorded your attendance. However, Jill was able actually during the session here to add it to ProLearner. So if you do go to the chat Again, there's the attendance code for that. So once again, logging into TeachHub, going to the Pro Learner app, going to My Enrollments, entering that attendance code. I know that might be new to some people, but that's how it's possible. If you're not able to do that, just kind of relax and take a page from our trauma-informed practices and understand that things will be resolved in time. Let's just be patient and give everyone a little grace as we work with some of the new technology. Um, yeah, I think that's all we have on our end. So um, just want to pause here. So if anyone wants to bring up a question, um, especially for Amanda about the content that she shared, kind of letting that open for you. And I'm going to stop the recording.